The tragic fate of the 12 apostles, the bloody deaths that were hidden. They walked alongside Jesus, witnessing miracles, hearing his words, and spreading his message. But after his crucifixion, their lives took a dark and brutal turn. Hunted, tortured, and executed in ways too horrific to imagine, each of them met a fate soaked in blood. But why were they targeted? What made these men so dangerous that rulers and empires sought to silence them forever? They weren't warriors, nor were they political rebels. They carried no weapons, only words that shook the foundations of power, and for that they paid the ultimate price. Their deaths were not just tragedies, they were powerful testimonies of faith, each one marked by suffering yet unwavering devotion. Some were crucified, others beheaded, burned alive, or even skinned. Yet, despite the horrors they endured, none of them renounced their beliefs. For centuries, these stories have been whispered, hidden in the shadows of history. Now it's time to uncover the truth, the untold, gruesome fate of the 12 apostles. Peter, the humble rock of the church. Peter was not just another disciple. He was the foundation upon which Jesus built his church. Bold, passionate, and often impulsive, Peter was the first to declare Jesus as the Messiah. He walked on water, witnessed the transfiguration, and yet, when the moment of trial came, he denied Jesus 3 times. But redemption followed. Peter became a fearless preacher, traveling across the Roman Empire, converting thousands and challenging the most powerful authorities of his time. But his faith put a target on his back. In the years following Christ's resurrection, Rome grew increasingly hostile toward Christians. Under Emperor Nero's reign, persecution became a spectacle, with believers being fed to lions, burned alive, and crucified. Peter was arrested in Rome and sentenced to death. Yet when faced with the same fate as his Lord, he made an unusual request. He asked to be crucified upside down. The executioners obliged. Bound to a wooden cross, his head hanging downward, Peter endured unimaginable agony. Blood rushed to his skull, his lungs struggled for air, and every breath became torture. Yet, despite the excruciating pain, he refused to cry out. He accepted his fate not with fear, but with unwavering devotion. He did not see himself as worthy to die in the same manner as Jesus, so he chose a path of even greater suffering. Peter's crucifixion was more than just an execution. It was a testament to his transformation. From a fisherman to a disciple, from a coward to a martyr, he became the embodiment of sacrifice. His blood stained the streets of Rome, but his faith endured. His story echoes through history, a reminder that true conviction cannot be silenced, not even by death. But Peter's fate was only the beginning. The other apostles would soon meet their own terrifying ends, each one more brutal than the last, and their deaths carried a message, a truth so powerful that it threatened the mightiest empires. What happened to the rest of them? The answers are more horrifying than you think. James the Greater, a death by the sword. James, the son of Zebedee, was one of Jesus' closest disciples, standing beside him during the most pivotal moments of his ministry. He was there when Jesus raised Jairus' daughter from the dead. He witnessed the transfiguration on the mountaintop. And when Jesus prayed in agony at Gethsemane, James was among the few chosen to keep watch. But what awaited him after Jesus' ascension was not glory or power. It was a swift and brutal execution. As the message of Christ spread, so did opposition. The Jewish authorities and Roman officials saw the apostles not as messengers of peace, but as agitators, threatening the religious and political order. James, a fiery and passionate preacher, became one of their primary targets. Around AD 44, King Herod Agrippa I, eager to win favor with Jewish leaders, made a decisive move. He ordered James's immediate arrest and execution. There was no trial, no public outcry. James was dragged before the authorities, sentenced without hesitation, and led to his death. The punishment was beheading, a method reserved for criminals and traitors. He had no chance to plead his case, no opportunity to defend his faith. But James did not resist. He did not beg for mercy. Instead, he accepted his fate with quiet resolve, knowing he would soon see his Lord again. But something remarkable happened just before the sword fell. A Roman guard assigned to James's execution had been deeply moved by the apostle's unwavering faith. Witnessing James's calmness in the face of death, the guard experienced a sudden change of heart. In that moment, he declared himself a Christian, renounced his allegiance to Rome, and knelt beside James. The executioner hesitated, but orders were orders. And so, in a single stroke, the sword fell. Twice. James was beheaded, his blood staining the ground, and beside him, the guard who had once been his captor died as his brother in faith. James's death sent shockwaves through the Christian community. He was the first of the apostles to be martyred, the first to shed his blood for the name of Christ. His execution was meant to silence the movement, to instill fear in those who followed him, but instead, it had the opposite effect. His sacrifice became a rallying cry, a testament to the power of belief. And yet this was only the beginning. The persecution would grow more violent, more merciless. The rest of the apostles would soon face their own horrific fates. And some of them would endure death so cruel, so inhuman, that even their executioners recoiled in horror. Who would be next? And how far would the world go to erase their message? John, a life of suffering in exile. John, the beloved disciple, was the only apostle who did not die a martyr's death. Yet his suffering was no less severe. He was one of Jesus' closest followers, the only one who remained at the cross, and the one to whom Jesus entrusted his mother. After Christ's resurrection, John became a pillar of the early church, preaching with unwavering faith. But as Christianity spread, Rome saw him as a dangerous threat. Under Emperor Domitian's reign, Christians faced brutal persecution. John, one of the last surviving apostles, was captured and sentenced to a horrific execution, boiling alive in oil. Before a crowd expecting a gruesome death, John was lowered into the bubbling vat. But what happened next defied explanation. He did not scream. His body did not burn. He emerged completely unharmed. It was an undeniable miracle. Shaken by what they had witnessed, the authorities abandoned their attempt to kill him, but they could not allow him to continue preaching. Instead, they exiled him to the remote island of Patmos, a desolate and rocky land meant to break his spirit. Alone, cut off from the world, John could have given in to despair. But instead, he received one of the most profound visions in history, the revelation of Jesus Christ. He saw the final battle between good and evil, the fall of earthly kingdoms, and the triumphant return of the Lord. His writings would become the Book of Revelation, a prophecy that continues to shape Christian belief today. After the death of Emperor Domitian, John was released from exile and returned to Ephesus, where he spent his last days guiding the church. He died peacefully in old age, the only apostle to escape execution. But his suffering had been immense. He had watched his fellow apostles be slaughtered one by one until he was the last man standing. John's story was unique, but it was not without sacrifice. His life was a testament that faith cannot be silenced, even when death refuses to take you. Yet while John lived out his final days in peace, the next apostle would endure something far more horrific. Andrew's death would be slow, agonizing, and unforgettable, a crucifixion unlike any other. Andrew, a slow and agonizing end. Andrew, the brother of Peter, was among the first to follow Jesus. A humble fisherman turned disciple, he spent his life bringing others to Christ. His faith led him far beyond Judea, to Greece, Scythia, and even the distant lands of modern-day Russia. But it was in the city of Patras, Greece, where his unwavering devotion would lead to his brutal death. Andrew's preaching angered the Roman governor, who saw his teachings as a direct threat to pagan traditions. When Andrew refused to renounce Christ, he was sentenced to death, but not by a swift execution. Instead, he was to be crucified in the most agonizing way possible. Unlike a standard crucifixion, Andrew was not nailed to the cross. Instead, his hands and feet were tied with ropes to an X-shaped cross, now famously known as St. Andrew's Cross. This method ensured that his death would be drawn out, making every hour more excruciating. For 2 long days, Andrew hung there, his body racked with pain, his muscles slowly giving out, yet his voice never faltered. Instead of cries for mercy, the people of Patras heard something else, Andrew preaching from the cross. Even in suffering, he continued to proclaim the gospel, urging those who watched to turn to Christ. His words were so powerful that the very crowd witnessing his execution began demanding his release. Fearful of an uprising, the governor finally relented and ordered Andrew to be taken down. But as the soldiers approached, a strange event occurred. Andrew lifted his eyes to the heavens, smiled, and took his final breath. His body went limp before they could untie him. He had died before his captors could grant him freedom. Andrew's death was more than just an execution. It was a testament to endurance, faith, and ultimate devotion. He could have pleaded for his life, but he chose instead to use his last breath to spread the message of Christ. Even in his final moments, he remained an apostle, preaching from the cross that would become his symbol for eternity. But Andrew's fate was only one chapter in this story of suffering. The next apostle, Philip, would also meet a terrible end. Unlike Andrew, his execution would be far more public, far more humiliating, and shockingly cruel. Philip, a martyr's defiance. Philip was one of Jesus' earliest followers, known for his deep faith and commitment to spreading the gospel. After Christ's resurrection, he traveled far beyond Judea, preaching in Phrygia, where he converted many, including the wife of a powerful Roman governor. This act enraged the authorities, who saw Christianity as a direct threat to Rome's pagan traditions. Determined to make an example of him, they arrested Philip and sentenced him to a slow, humiliating death. His execution was meant to be a public spectacle. Philip was stripped, beaten, and dragged through the city, his body bruised and bleeding. The Romans wanted him to suffer, so instead of a quick death, they hung him upside down on a cross. This method ensured prolonged agony, his body weight crushing his lungs, his blood rushing to his head, and every breath becoming more painful than the last. But Philip did not scream. He did not curse his captors. Instead, he prayed for the city, for those watching, even for the very men who nailed him to the cross. His words were not cries of pain, but blessings of forgiveness. As he hung there, gasping for breath, something extraordinary happened. The ground trembled beneath the execution site. The sky darkened. A sense of dread spread through the crowd. Some believed it was a sign of divine wrath, and panic took hold. Fearful that they had angered the gods, Roman officials ordered Philip to be taken down from the cross, but it was too late. Philip had already died, his final words spoken in prayer. The very city that had condemned him would later become a center of Christianity, forever marked by his sacrifice. His death was not a defeat, it was a victory of faith over fear. Yet, if Philip's suffering was heartbreaking, Bartholomew's fate would be even more terrifying. His execution would not come swiftly. His torment would be prolonged, his body subjected to an unthinkable horror. For Bartholomew, death would come one layer at a time, literally. Bartholomew, a death beyond imagination. Bartholomew, also known as Nathanael, was a man of deep faith, described by Jesus as a man in whom there is no deceit. He traveled far, bringing the gospel to places few dared to go. His missionary journey took him to India, Armenia, and Persia, where he fearlessly spread the message of Christ. But in Armenia, his faith would lead him to one of the most gruesome deaths in history. Bartholomew's preaching had angered the local rulers, especially after he converted the king's brother to Christianity. This act was seen as an attack on the kingdom's pagan traditions, and the response was swift and merciless. Bartholomew was arrested and sentenced to die, not by crucifixion, not by beheading, but by the most excruciating execution imaginable. His punishment? Being skinned alive. The executioners began peeling away his skin, starting from his back and slowly working their way across his body. Every nerve was exposed, every inch of his flesh burned with unimaginable pain. But even as strips of skin were torn from his body, Bartholomew did not scream. He did not beg for mercy. Instead, he continued to pray, his faith unshaken even as his body was being destroyed. The torture lasted for hours, possibly even longer. His tormentors, expecting cries of agony, were met with unwavering resolve. Some accounts say that even after being completely flayed, he was still alive, still breathing, still whispering prayers. To finally end his suffering, the executioners beheaded him, leaving his mutilated body behind as a warning to others. But the warning failed. Instead of instilling fear, Bartholomew's death inspired more conversions. His martyrdom became a powerful testament that no pain, no suffering, and no human cruelty could break the spirit of a true follower of Christ. Yet, if Bartholomew's fate was horrific, Thomas would endure something just as brutal. His death would come in a distant land, far from home, where he would face the cold steel of spears piercing his body. And even in his final moments, he would refuse to be silent. Thomas, a faith that could not be silenced. Thomas is often remembered as Doubting Thomas, the one who refused to believe in Christ's resurrection until he touched the wounds himself. But beyond that moment of hesitation, he became one of the most courageous and devoted apostles, traveling further than almost any other disciple. He took the gospel to Parthia, Persia, and India, establishing Christian communities in places where the name of Jesus had never been heard. His work in India was particularly powerful. He preached fearlessly, converting many, including members of royal families. But his influence also made him enemies. Hindu priests and local rulers saw him as a direct threat to their religious traditions and power. As more people turned to Christ, opposition against him grew. Soon, the order was given. Thomas had to die. The assassination was swift but brutal. While he was praying in a cave near Millipore, a group of soldiers ambushed him. Armed with spears, they pierced his body multiple times, each strike intended to silence him forever. But Thomas did not die immediately. Bleeding and in agony, he crawled to a nearby altar where he had often prayed. There, with his final breaths, he lifted his hands to heaven and whispered his last prayers. He did not curse his killers. He did not fight back. Instead, he offered his suffering to God, embracing the very death he once doubted. His body was later buried in India, and to this day the Christian community he helped establish still exists. His death did not end his mission, it strengthened it. The very land where he was murdered became home to one of the oldest Christian traditions in the world. But if Thomas's death was violent, Matthew's would be just as chilling. His fate would be sealed not by spears, but by the cold steel of a sword, delivered in a moment of betrayal that no one saw coming. Matthew, a martyr. Betrayed. Matthew was once a tax collector, a man despised by his own people. But when Jesus called him, he left behind his wealth and security to follow a higher calling. After the resurrection, he became a passionate preacher, taking the gospel to Ethiopia, Persia, and possibly Syria, fearlessly spreading the message of Christ. But his growing influence in Ethiopia would seal his fate. Matthew's words converted many, including local leaders, which angered the ruling class. The authorities saw Christianity as a dangerous movement, one that threatened their power and traditions. Matthew was warned to stop preaching, but he refused. He knew the risks, yet he continued, determined to bring the light of Christ to those trapped in darkness. The attack came without warning. Some say that while he was praying inside a newly built church, soldiers stormed in and seized him. Others claim he was dragged into the marketplace, where a public execution would serve as a warning to his followers. Regardless of how it began, the ending was the same. Matthew was killed by the sword, his blood soaking the earth beneath him. His death was meant to silence the faith, but it only made it stronger. The very land where he was murdered became one of the earliest Christian strongholds. His followers, instead of cowering in fear, spread his teachings even further, ensuring that his sacrifice was not in vain. Yet, while Matthew's death was swift, James, the son of Alphaeus, would endure something far more gruesome. He would be led to the highest point of the temple, not to preach, but to be thrown down like a piece of broken glass, his body crushed against the earth. But what happened after his fall would be even more horrifying. James, son of Alphaeus. But death did not come quickly. James, the son of Alphaeus, was a quiet but faithful disciple. Though he did not seek attention, his devotion to Christ was unshakable. After the resurrection, he became a leader of the church in Jerusalem, boldly preaching the gospel in the very heart of opposition. But in the eyes of the Jewish authorities, his influence had grown too powerful. They decided to eliminate him, but not with a swift execution. They wanted to make an example out of him. One day, James was seized by temple officials and dragged to the pinnacle of the temple in Jerusalem, the very place where Jesus had once been tempted by Satan. Below him, a crowd gathered, expecting a public denunciation of Christ. Instead, James fearlessly proclaimed Jesus as the Son of God. His enemies, enraged, had heard enough. They pushed him off the edge. James plunged from the great height, his body slamming into the ground below. Bones shattered, blood spilled onto the stone pavement, but against all odds, he was still alive. Broken and gasping, he struggled to lift himself. Instead of pleading for mercy, he did something that stunned the crowd. He began to pray. "Lord, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." His words echoed those of Christ on the cross, sending a wave of unease through the bystanders. Some began to murmur, wondering if they had just made a mistake, but the officials would not allow doubt to spread. In a final act of cruelty, a mob descended upon James, beating him with clubs and stones. One of them grabbed a fuller's club used to press and clean garments and struck James's skull, crushing it instantly. His lifeless body was left on the ground, a silent testament to his faith. But his death did not have the intended effect. Instead of ending his movement, his martyrdom ignited the faith of many, strengthening the very church that his killers sought to destroy. Yet, while James's death was brutal, Simon the Zealot's fate would be even more horrifying. He would endure a form of execution so gruesome that even the hardened executioners recoiled. His end would not come by falling or beating, but by being torn apart piece by piece until nothing remained. Simon the Zealot, a death too horrifying to forget. Simon the Zealot was a man of passion and fire. Before following Jesus, he had been part of the Zealots, a revolutionary group that sought to overthrow Roman rule. But after encountering Christ, his zeal was no longer for war, it was for spreading the gospel. He traveled across the empire, preaching in Persia and North Africa, leading many to Christ. But in the end, his fiery faith would lead to one of the most horrific executions imaginable. Simon's bold preaching enraged the authorities in Persia, who saw Christianity as a direct challenge to their religious system. He was arrested and sentenced to a death designed not just to kill, but to terrify anyone who followed his message. His executioners wanted to send a clear message, one that would strike fear into the hearts of believers. Some accounts say Simon was sawed in half, his body split apart while he was still alive. Others claim he was tied to 2 horses, which were then driven in opposite directions, ripping his limbs from his body. Either way, his death was slow, agonizing, and brutal. But Simon did not break. Even as his body was torn apart, he never renounced his faith. His final words were prayers, his last breath spent in devotion to Christ. His killers expected his gruesome death to destroy the faith of those who followed him. But instead, his sacrifice inspired even more conversions. The people who witnessed his suffering did not see defeat. They saw a man so devoted to God that even the most horrifying pain could not silence him. Yet, if Simon's death was savage, Jude Thaddaeus would suffer a fate just as brutal. His life would end beneath the blows of a heavy club, his skull shattered, his blood staining the earth, and with every strike, his enemies believed they were silencing the truth, but the truth was only growing stronger. Jude Thaddaeus, a martyr's skull crushed. Jude Thaddaeus, often called simply Thaddaeus, was known as the Apostle of Hope. He traveled across Mesopotamia and Persia, bringing the message of Christ to lands ruled by pagan kings. His words carried power, converting many, but also drawing the fury of those who refused to let go of their traditions. His faith would cost him everything. In Persia, Jude's teachings infuriated the local priests, who saw him as a direct threat to their authority. They demanded that he renounce his faith, but he refused. His punishment would not be swift. Instead, they wanted him to suffer. A mob gathered. Armed with clubs and stones, they surrounded him, striking him repeatedly. Blow after blow, his body collapsed, his flesh torn open, yet he did not cry out. He refused to curse his captors. Instead, he prayed, even as the pain consumed him. But the mob was not satisfied. A soldier stepped forward, wielding a heavy club. He lifted it high and brought it down upon Jude's head, the sound of bone shattering echoing through the streets. The apostle fell, his blood pooling beneath him. His skull was crushed, his body lifeless, but his faith remained unbroken. The very people who had murdered him believed they had silenced his message, but they were wrong. Jude's teaching spread far beyond Persia, reaching distant lands. Even in death, his name became a symbol of unwavering faith, and his prayers became a source of hope for generations. Yet, if Jude's fate was brutal, one final apostle still remained. His name was Judas Iscariot, but his death was not a martyr's sacrifice. It was an end fueled by guilt, despair, and ultimate betrayal. His story would be the darkest of them all. Judas Iscariot, a death by despair. Judas Iscariot's name has become synonymous with betrayal, a man remembered not for his discipleship, but for the act that led to Christ's crucifixion. He walked with Jesus, saw his miracles, and heard his teachings. Yet, in the end, he chose to sell his master for 30 pieces of silver. But what followed his betrayal was not triumph nor satisfaction. It was a descent into darkness, regret, and a death unlike any other apostle. After handing Jesus over to the religious authorities, Judas watched as events unfolded. He had expected a trial, perhaps even a rebuke or exile for Jesus. But then came the sentence, death by crucifixion. That was never part of his plan. As Jesus was led away, beaten and humiliated, something inside Judas broke. Overcome with guilt, he returned the silver to the priests, pleading, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." But they dismissed him coldly, saying, "What is that to us? That's your problem." The money meant nothing now. The weight of his betrayal was crushing him. Desperate, Judas fled into the wilderness, his mind consumed by regret. There was no escape from the guilt that tormented him. He had turned his back on the very Messiah he once followed, and now there was no way to undo it. The silver coins, now worthless to him, clattered to the ground as he made his final decision. In a grove of trees, Judas tied a rope around his neck and hanged himself. Some accounts say the branch snapped, causing his body to fall and burst open upon the rocks below, his intestines spilling out, a gruesome end to a soul in torment. Unlike the other apostles, Judas did not die as a martyr. He did not perish in the name of Christ. Instead, he died in isolation, despair, and self-inflicted punishment. His story stands as a warning, not of persecution, but of the devastation that comes from turning away from the truth. With Judas' death, the story of the 12 apostles comes to a close. They lived for Christ, they suffered for him, and they died for the faith they refused to abandon. Their blood became the foundation of the church, and their sacrifices continue to inspire believers even today. But their deaths were not the end. The movement they died for only grew stronger, spreading across the world, defying every empire that tried to erase it. Their voices were never silenced. Their legacy remains eternal. The legacy of the 12. The 12 apostles walked with Jesus, witnessed his miracles, and carried his message to the ends of the earth. They were fishermen, tax collectors, revolutionaries, ordinary men transformed into the pillars of Christianity. But their faith came at a cost. Every one of them suffered, every one of them was hunted, and almost every one of them was killed in brutal, agonizing ways. Their enemies believed that by silencing them, they could extinguish the fire of Christianity. But they were wrong. Instead of dying out, the message of Christ spread further than ever before. The apostles' deaths became the seeds of a faith that no sword, no cross, and no empire could destroy. Their blood stained the streets of Jerusalem, Rome, Persia, and India, but it did not silence their voices. Today, over 2 billion people follow the teachings of Christ, a testament to the courage of these 12 men. Their suffering was not in vain. It became the foundation upon which the church was built. But this story is not just about history. It is about conviction. It is about the power of belief in the face of persecution. It is about the truth that no force on earth can erase. So the question remains, if faith was worth dying for back then, is it still worth living for today?